talked about bad guys using AI, right? Think about you've talked about cyber criminals, but you've also got China and Russia using AI to up their disinformation campaigns. And China's been hacking for years, stealing information. Think about how they can use information on the open web and hacked information that they've stolen in LLMs to be able to do better impersonations, to be able to do better social engineering when it comes to phishing campaigns.
Welcome to Unnatural Selection, a show about competition, innovation, and the strategies shaping tomorrow's frontiers. I'm Nick Encina. Each week, we speak with pioneers shaping the future.
Welcome to episode 43 of Unnatural Selection. In this conversation, Nick speaks with Rajeev Raghavan, who has advised the FBI director and other senior government leaders on some of the most pressing challenges in cybercrime, national security, and emerging technologies like AI. Together, they explore the relentless fight against cybercrime, from nimble decentralized groups to nation-state actors, and how innovation, collaboration, and preparation define the battle to protect our critical infrastructure and the trust that holds society together. Most recently, Mr. Raghavan was special counsel to the FBI director, helping guide the FBI's efforts to navigate new technological challenges, as well as advising the director and other senior government leaders on major cyber, national security, and criminal cases. From the director's office, Mr. Raghavan worked with the FBI's Cyber Division and the Department of Justice to strengthen cyber policy initiatives, including private sector and public outreach, victim engagement, threat prioritization, and enhancing the FBI's cyber workforce. Mr. Raghavan also played a key role in driving FBI's strategy for the reauthorization of a vital national security authority, FISA Section 702. With the emergence of AI, Mr. Raghavan helped shape FBI's policy and strategy for the use of AI, as well as protecting the private sector from AI-enabled threats, developing messaging for the director on this cutting-edge issue. Prior to his time at the FBI, Mr. Raghavan served in the Department of Justice as an assistant U.S. attorney for the District of Maryland. In that role, Mr. Raghavan prosecuted a wide variety of federal criminal cases, including cyber, national security, public corruption, and financial fraud. Mr. Raghavan was the sole prosecutor that investigated and charged the operator of WT1 Shop, one of the largest online marketplaces for stolen credentials. He also led the prosecution of a defendant who sent threats via an anonymous encrypted email account to doctors at the National Institutes of Health during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. In recognition of his work as a prosecutor, Mr. Raghavan was awarded the United States Attorney's Office FBI Service Award and received a letter of recognition from the U.S. Postal Service for his work on fraud matters. Let's go.
Rajeev, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to Unnatural Selection.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick.
Looking forward to this conversation. I'll be the first one to admit it's something I know very little about. And so I really look forward to these things because I'm learning along with the audience as we're asking questions. So I like to start with a very high level foundational question to hear from the guests directly. What passion motivates the things that you do? So with that, Rajeev, could you please let us know what impact or need drove what you did at the Department of Justice?
Of course. Listen, I've been very lucky in my government service career to spend time in both the law enforcement and the national security spaces, right? And what motivates many of us who do this work is to protect our communities, seek justice for victims, and hold the bad guys accountable. And I've been fortunate to be a federal prosecutor investigating crimes and charging the bad guys. And in that role, I was what's called a computer hacking and intellectual property attorney, so a CHIP. And I prosecuted technology-enabled crimes like business email compromise schemes, ransomware, social media-based frauds. And I was a programmer before I went to law school. So needless to say, I loved working on these cases. The challenge of being at the cutting edge of technology, where the criminals, of course, are, and working with law enforcement to find out who's responsible and how to hold them accountable. And getting justice for victims is one of the greatest satisfactions. I remember this case I worked on when I was in Maryland, where we had a $500,000 social media fraud scheme that targeted elders from across the country. The criminals represented themselves as agents of real or fictitious government agencies and offered victims financial rewards if the victims, first sent cash or gift cards. And the defendant we charged was the point person for this criminal conspiracy here in the US. He gave the conspirators this legitimacy by having a US based address. So victims would send him their cash or gift cards. He'd take a percentage for himself and then send the rest on to his conspirators in Nigeria. And the impact of this fraud on his victims was devastating. We had victims, some elderly victims, and some of their family members submit statements. And it wasn't just financial pain, for them losing all of their savings, but the mental and emotional anguish that followed and continued to follow them in their lives. Some of the elderly victims were retired; they needed to go back to work. Some were so afraid of being swindled that they lost the ability to function and be part of the world. They spoke about how, they had their relationships with their spouses and their children's ruined, just this mass of pain and horror emanating from the crime. And getting a significant sentence in that case, getting justice for the victims, ensuring that they had a moment in court where a federal judge could hear about their pain and suffering, it was one of the most fulfilling moments in my life. And then after that, being a prosecutor, I had the opportunity to work with folks at the highest level of the DOJ and the FBI and the FBI director's office to solve some of the most toughest organizational and policy issues like AI, encryption, and working with the private sector on cyber and other issues, working with other agencies and Congress on, as you mentioned, this legislative push to reauthorize FISA 702, which is a critical national security authority that FBI personnel need to protect us. And it's all driven by the very same mission, like when I was a line prosecutor, to keep our community safe and help get justice for victims.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, from a purely private citizen consumer standpoint, what I see are the endless voicemails and emails, but mostly voicemails. Like my phone has become useless at this point because I get nonstop messages about some loan that I took out or some financial this or whatever. And it's annoying to the point that literally I get yelled at by my wife because I don't pick up the phone. Right? It just become pointless. I can only imagine what it means for people that are maybe more vulnerable, like so the elderly or other people that might see these things and actually respond to them and find themselves in a lot of trouble. But even still, that's what I see. That's the level that I see, and I'm sure there's an entire iceberg underneath that tip of what actually happens and the things that you deal with. And it almost feels like, when I really think about it, like and a perpetual and nonstop and accelerating cat and mouse game that the FBI has to be playing with these criminals all around the world, trying to exploit new technologies to say, how do I get a penny or a dollar or $1 million out of somebody? Before getting too deep into that, can you tell us, for people that are not familiar with this world, me being one of them, um, give us just a quick overview of what the FBI and Department of Justice do when it comes to cybercrime?
Of course, yeah. So DOJ and FBI's main responsibility is to investigate, charge, and hold accountable criminals who violate federal laws, right? And that applies equally to domestic and international cyber criminals and rogue nation state, cyber actors. And I think most people are familiar with the fact that, DOJ's prosecutors, they work with law enforcement to investigate crimes. You go to a grand jury, you obtain an indictment, and then law enforcement goes out to arrest the bad guys, and they have their day in court, or they take a plea. And I think that's clearly an effective strategy where we have criminals, say, in the United States, or what we call rule of law countries, right? Countries that respect, the laws and laws of other countries and are willing to extradite criminals in their countries. But as we're increasingly seeing, many cyber criminals are operating from and taking refuge in countries like Russia, China, North Korea, where the government just not only turns a blind eye to the criminals, but in fact fosters that criminal element, right? And it's so long as these bad guys are setting their sights outside of the country, and the criminals themselves are globalizing in their operating model. They're using servers and crypto tumblers from a variety of different countries. They're working with co-conspirators without regard for national boundaries. And so this evolution has required the FBI to change its thinking as well. So in 2020, the FBI announced a new strategy to not only disrupt the actors, but also their infrastructure and their money. So, in effect, make it harder for them to run these campaigns and, importantly, deny the bad guys the spoils of their criminal efforts. So, arrest where possible, of course, but also strategically use the FBI's tools and the DOJ's tools to seize domains, servers, cryptocurrency, all of these various legs that prop up this criminal network, right? This global criminal organizations. And because the rogue cyber element is globalized, the DOJ and FBI need to work with their international partners. So kind of every partner agency using their own unique tools and authorities to disrupt and take down bad guys. And while the law enforcement coordination is primarily in the FBI's ambit, and of course DOJ is focused on their prosecutor counterparts, for both the FBI and DOJ, it includes developing international standards, norms surrounding cyber, cryptocurrency, you name it. A lot of coordination with state and local authorities, the private sector, especially because, we all know, they're a frequent target by the bad guys. And that private sector coordination is essential because significant portion of the valuable threat intelligence that's out there is on their systems. And so it's important for the FBI and the agencies to get it so they can understand the threat and prioritize. And that coordination is important for the companies as well, because it it behooves them to build a relationship with the FBI, because as they're evaluating their cyber posture, their policies, their playbooks. They run tabletop exercises, all the kind of things that you need to do to make sure you're on top of your cyber game. Intelligence from the FBI can help them stay abreast of the attack vectors and, in fact, protect them. And even after an attack, working with law enforcement, it can be crucial because law enforcement sometimes is on the bad guys. They've got access to their systems. We've seen that where they have access to decryption keys, and they can help if you've been the victim of a ransomware attack to get to those decryption keys quickly before you have to pay a ransom. And I think the most important thing, right, is everyone working in stride on both the public and private side to combat these increasing and diverse threats.
Hmm. Yeah, like you mentioned, it's the threats are coming. A lot of them are coming from abroad, and like you said, countries that either turn a blind eye or are actively fostering and sponsoring a lot of this work. So it's got to make your work so hard because also a lot of these threats and the organizations behind it, they operate like agile startups, which is make it very hard for an organization, institution based on laws and process and workflows to be able to adapt to a fast moving and adaptable and decentralized organization like these threats that are coming at you from multiple directions, multiple countries. Um, and 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 still be able to do that under the rule of law that the FBI has to follow. Um, what was that experience like for you? I guess from your perspective, where do you start?
Yeah.
It's almost like you're getting attacked from everywhere in all kinds of different directions and different vertices and different structures and approaches. Where do you draw the line? Because your resources aren't unlimited, right? Your attention, your time, and your team's time was limited. And so I couldn't even imagine just sitting there and being like, okay, step one. How do you approach that problem?
I mean, listen, when you are a line prosecutor, sometimes it's like, blind federal prosecutor, it's like drinking from a fire hose, right? The number of cases that are there that you could work on and prosecute are a ton. And then you go up to this higher organizational level and start thinking about these problems. I mean, you touched on it, right? Which is the technology itself is allowing for a continuous evolution for the criminals. But it's not just technology. They're almost like a business. They're evolving their business model as they go through these cyber campaigns, as they see how victims respond, how law enforcement responds. So just take ransomware. Originally they'd access your system, deploy their ransomware, lock up your system, and then demand money. And it was a tried and true formula that worked. Then they started stealing your data before they locked it up. And so demanding a ransom not only to unencrypt your data, but also so that they don't release it on the web. So almost a double extortion at that point. And then they evolved again. So you start stealing your data, then threatening to leak or release that data if an additional payment is not made. So triple extortion. And then, as we talked about, with these countries that are fostering the criminal element, we're seeing this blended threat where previously you had nation state hackers and cyber criminals as two distinct groups. Well, the nation state hackers aren't getting paid enough money. So now they're moonlighting as cyber criminals. And you've got them also, these nation state hackers employing cyber criminals or corporate hackers to carry out their hacking campaigns. And then you've got nation state hackers using cyber criminal tools to mask their actions and attribution. And of course, the rogue nations are allowing all of this to operate with, impunity. And they've gotten a lot sophisticated as well in who and how they target. They want to get paid and they want to get paid quickly, so they're looking for the biggest bang for their buck. And they've realized the best way to make that happen is to target the stuff that we can't live without every single day, the services that we need. So schools, hospitals, water, electricity, critical infrastructure. We've seen a recent hack of a nursery chain in the UK, and the bad guys threatening to release data if a ransom isn't paid. And then we've talked about the criminal ecosystem, but we've got now folks who aren't looking to just be that point of attack, but rather the ones who want to prop up this criminal ecosystem and get paid for it. So ransomware as a service, where skilled coders develop sophisticated malware and platforms and allow lesser, technically skilled criminals to use their platforms to launch attacks and deploy malware. For the lesser skilled criminal, that's a chance to make some fast money. For the higher skilled criminal, it's almost like getting the benefits of distribution. You take a percentage of all the ill-gotten proceeds. And then you've got folks running crypto tumblers to help these bad guys launder their proceeds. And each one of the legs of the criminal enterprise operates to profit from the whole criminal ecosystem. So a good example of this is Lockbit, the ransomware group. And the administrator of that service received a 20% cut of whatever ransoms were collected from people and companies around the world. And he provided assistance through hosting and storage by estimating optimal ransom demands and laundering currency. And he even gave discounts to high volume customers. So it's literally a business. And that's really where we are as organized crime in cyberspace.
What are the possible repercussions for a nation state that supports this? As I think about it, um, I feel like there's like on the war side, there's like mutually assured annihilation, right? You don't send us bombs, we don't send you bombs, and we're happy that way. It feels like these nation states are sponsoring or turning a blind eye to what they're sending our way. We, on the other hand, if we have organizations like that doing that here, and doing it to people in China or in Russia, presumably the FBI is going to shut them down because they're like doing crime, and so they're going to go after them. So it feels like a very lopsided war. Um, and I don't expect an answer for this because I don't think there is one. It's not like the FBI is going to be like, "Oh, go ahead and do it," because that's not the way we do things here in this country.
Correct.
But it just
Yes.
feels like such a losing battle when you have these countries that, like you said, they go along and do this with impunity. There's nothing we can really do to China, and there is no mutual annihilation kind of front to say, well, if you do it to us, we're going to do it to you. And so it feels like such a hard battle to fight.
I think yeah, there's a way in which you can easily get disheartened in all of this and think the vastness and the enormity and the scope of it. But I'll say what it really comes down to is international partnerships, right? Folks working together, whether it's us and our Five Eye partners, us and other rule of law countries working together to, something that we've done previously is indeed name and shame, and essentially put the spotlight on these countries that are doing this and kind of they thrive in anonymity. They thrive when that veil of secrecy is there and lifting that veil of secrecy, right? And so, as we've seen over the past few years, much of the FBI's and DOJ's success is rooted in partnerships. Partnerships with the members of the intelligence community, international partners, and definitely the private sector. When you introduced me, you talked about one of my cases, WT1 Shop, right? That was a case where we spent months investigating this website. It was an online marketplace that allowed vendors to sell stolen logins, driver's licenses, bank accounts, credit cards. Some like 5.85 million items were on there. And thanks to the work of the FBI, we determined that the operator was a Moldovan national who was using servers in the Netherlands and Portugal to operate. And so, in coordination with law enforcement partners in those countries, we executed an operation to seize the servers in Portugal, charge the operator over here in the United States, and seize the US-based domains as well, all in one day, disrupting this large criminal marketplace of stolen personal data. And during my time at the Bureau, the FBI has deployed operations like this to great effect. Lockbit, Genesis Market, IVE, the ransomware group, kind of showing again and again that partnerships are key to combating this globalized and asymmetric threat. Because we've seen bad guys work across country lines and they're targeting victims regardless of national boundaries. So you've got to be working across country lines as well to combat this threat. And of course, the private sector, right? As we've talked about, they have some of the most robust and up-to-date intelligence, actionable intelligence that can help inform which bad guys and what criminal groups law enforcement and the intelligence community should prioritize. And I'll flag something over here, which is, one of the biggest enablers of this information sharing has been the 2015 Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. And one of the features of that act was that it offered legal protections for companies that share threat information with law enforcement. Now, as we record this week, CISA 2015 expired this week. And those important legal protections that are crucial to information sharing have are essentially gone away. The good thing is that Congress recognizes the importance of this law because the House CR that was floated before the shutdown included a short-term extension of CISA 2015, delaying the deadline by a couple of months. And now I want to be clear. A short-term extension is definitely better than nothing. But short-term extensions create their own uncertainty for organizations that can rely on the Act's reporting requirements. And they can just as strongly disincentivize threat information sharing, putting into jeopardy this decade of progress in the crucial public-private partnership. Because it's hard for organizations to build processes, plan for the future with the constantly moving legal landscape. And the consequence of all of that is that without these protections, companies will hesitate to report vulnerabilities. That leaves everyone at risk because when one tip comes in from a target organization, it can result, I've seen it result in, thousands being warned before the attack. And so it's absolutely crucial that we continue this partnership on the international space, the public-private space, to really push this forward because that's one of the ways in which we can kind of, get to deterrence in this space.
As I listen to all of this, I can't help but reflect on really the core premise behind this podcast is to look at innovation through the eyes of evolution and natural selection, and really think about natural selection as a derivative of or think of innovation. I'm sorry, as a derivative of natural selection, much more directed and conscious because it's driven by human thought and design. But then when I think about that analogy, this very much feels like an evolving immune system. It's like you have this cell with precious resources internally, proteins and nucleus and DNA and so on, and energy, the ATP and so on. And then you have these actors externally and some internally that are these vectors of attack, constantly trying to steal those resources or penetrate. You have viruses and so on. And it feels like almost an evolving ecosystem, and I can't help but envision and think about it and see a cell evolving its immune system to try to stay ahead of constant onslaught of actors trying to get to those resources.
I think that's correct, right? And just like the white blood cells, you're constantly, as you fight off each infection, you're learning from it and figuring out what's next and what's the best way to get ahead of the problem. And then, thankfully, we've got a lot of smart folks who are, working and developing vaccines that can help the white blood cells think and work faster. Those network defenders that are there in the public space and the private space who are doing this and keeping our systems safe. And so, it's really one thing that's very clear is it's an all hands effort to fight this because while the cyber element and the nation state rogue cyber element aren't working in concert, but also not working necessarily against each other. And so, we've got all of that coming at the same time, and so it requires everyone working together to push back against the threat.
That makes total sense. And we touched upon this a little bit, but you're getting hit by from so many different actors, and you mentioned just now white blood cells that they detect something, they learn from it, and then they adjust. So a lot of it sounds like it's you're responding or reacting to things that are coming your way. What level of being proactive and innovative? How does that play into the work that the FBI is doing? So in other words, like what role does innovation play in law enforcement and the intelligence community's ability to stay ahead of threats as opposed to reacting when something new comes your way?
Listen, I think innovation plays an absolutely crucial and large role across both the law enforcement and the national security intelligence community space, right? We've talked about how the criminals are continuously evolving and adapting to new technological vectors. And so it's incumbent on the good guys to do the exact same thing. But I'll say it's not just about adopting the latest technology, because you don't just adopt a technology for the sake of doing so. It's got to be in service of the mission. And that mission is constrained by, as we've talked about, we're a rule of law country. And it's constrained by the real constitutional legal protections that are important to our society. So, adoption of any new technology to counter threats has to be appropriately mindful and constrained by these protections, because the information that the FBI generates, the intelligence that it generates, not just going into a database somewhere to sit, right? It needs to be put into effect to be used to protect victims, our national security. It needs to be used in search warrants, in grand jury, for indictments and trials, and all of these things. And so it needs to have the full force that all of this intelligence should have to get justice for victims. And I think it might be helpful to think about innovation with what's, I guess, the most prevalent example today, which is AI, right? Everyone's talking about AI. And when I was in the director's office, it like in an instant, AI was just everywhere and everyone was talking about it. And so, of course, we needed to consider what AI meant for the FBI to kind of cut through that noise and focus on real strategic risk analysis. And for the FBI, that's anticipating and defending against threats from those who are using AI for malicious cyber activity and other crimes. And one part of this is about protecting systems, the FBI's as well, right? One of AI's chief benefits is its ability to continuously ingest and monitor large volumes of system data, like gigabytes of logs generated daily from systems and servers across the globe, and feeding that into AI models to detect atypical traffic patterns and user behaviors for potential insider threats in real time. And this kind of analysis can help network defenders in both the public and private space really up their game for network protection. Not just about locating the bad guys in your network, but also immediately executing automated defense tactics, isolating them, and even kicking them out. And just like the bad guys are using AI to hunt for vulnerabilities, organizations can use AI to find those same vulnerabilities in their software and their hardware first, mitigate them, or use AI to simulate attacks and learn from them. But I keep coming back to this thing about you not just using technology for the sake of using technology, right? And you can't just throw data that you've got in your systems and into an AI model and see what comes out the other side. And I think this is an area where, listen, the FBI, of course, has, different limits, constitutional limits, statutory limits, but there are, analogies to the private sector as well. Like, say you're a business and you obtain data from your defense, transportation, or aerospace clients, or from customers through the website. This is a lot of diverse data. It's important to carefully think through what constraints need to be placed on each data set, what permissions you have, and if there are limits on how they can be mingled and used. And that's very similar for the FBI too, right? FBI gets data from subpoenas, search warrants, all of this to, in pursuit of the mission. And that data is limited in how it can be used, right? Grand jury subpoena information that comes from a subpoena is limited in who it can be disseminated to. So it's crucial to think through this information and what are the legal limitations and all of the data issues that come up, and develop frameworks to, before just letting AI loose on your systems. But I think thinking through these problems and figuring out how to push forward, and whether it's the mission of the FBI or it's a business goal, that in itself, I think, is the crux of finding meaningful innovation when it comes to these technologies that you want to start using as soon as possible. And it's the best way to kind of take a considered, thoughtful approach that can really focus on the benefits to the organization and the mission. And that's really what we were focusing on as well.
That's incredible. As you were describing all these different, your experience and all these processes for doing this, I couldn't help but think about my experiences as startups, technology. We share that background with being computer scientists and software developers, helping start biotech companies. And when I've been involved in those things, we have the benefit of being very laser focused on one product or one industry, which is like, this is what we do. Everything how we structure ourselves and who we hire and our technologies and our skill sets and so on is directed towards doing something really good in this space. The FBI has to confront all kinds of threats coming in all kinds of different directions in a very fast paced, evolving space. And so, one thing that I was thinking about is when I've started companies, you try to structure them in such a way that you create a space. If you're doing innovation, you try to create a space of like intellectual safety, psychological safety, so people can take bets, they can explore things, they can innovate. You bring in skill sets around technology, maybe skill sets around a product line, and so on. And you start bringing people together. You start thinking about the culture, how to structure the even the environment, about how they work and how they collaborate with each other. And as I was thinking about that, I know how that playbook goes in a startup realm. But then I was thinking, I'm like, well, how does the FBI do this? Like, what's the structure? Because you can't possibly have people that are experts in everything from technology, AI, financial fraud, international policy, like blah, 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 like all the things that you're getting hit at the same time. So, what does the structure of the FBI look like to be able to confront all these challenges and create a space where you can have somebody who's an expert in AI, someone who's an expert in computer networking technology, someone who's an expert in financial fraud, and all the different things to be talking to each other. So you can actually do this innovation, right? Because it can't all live in Rajiv's head. You're like, you're
No,
not
no,
there.
it definitely does not. There are,
Eh,
listen, one of the I know you're saying like, how can you have all these experts? But the FBI does, right? The FBI has so many amazing experts on AI and computer science and and variety of frauds and crypto and all of these things, and they work closely together, right? One of the very cool things that I was able to get involved with and work the folks I worked with was the science and technology branch at the FBI, right? Folks who are focused on trying to solve these very hard technology problems and all of the kind of things that the bureau is not just facing right now, but could be facing in the future, right? And it was wonderful. It was you may not know this, but the FBI has a patent program. The FBI has patents. There, an FBI computer
Interesting.
scientist got a patent on being able to detect synthetic information, so essentially detect AI and videos and images generated through AI. And so that's the kind of innovation that's constantly happening at the bureau. That's happening across the DOJ, and it's happening at all levels. Right? It's not. It's happening at the headquarters. It's happening at field offices. One of the great things for me was when I would go with the director to visit a field office, and we'd learn and listen to the kind of innovation that they've been working on and things that they'd done, and they're immediately saying, "Why aren't we taking this and bringing this out to everybody? Everyone should be kind of working with this." And so sometimes field offices are this great incubation area where they can really work on something, develop it, and then they can look at how can we broaden this across the bureau. But at the end of the day, I think that the one great thing is also all of these folks are driven by the guiding principles and the FBI mission, which is to uphold the Constitution. And what we can sometimes think of as limitations, quote unquote limitations, aren't that. They're guiding principles for the bureau, that they're not just protecting Americans from physical and digital threats, but also doing so protecting civil liberties and civil rights. And so developing innovation within all of that is just it's a wonderful thing, and it was a very cool thing to see.
That does sound cool. If I can unpack that a little bit more, uh, I'm going to ask a question. It's not meant to be judgy. It's meant to really come from a place of ignorance, to try to like see it. Because I think people, from my perspective, we've seen so many movies that we think about the FBI as like people in suits operating in very rigid environments, black and white. And it's just obviously it's Hollywood. But as I think about all this, there has to be a tremendous amount of innovation that happens internally. And you just covered a lot of that. So really, if we think about the focus of this podcast is innovation, and part of the reason for unpacking it is to learn, to see what does the FBI do, what does opera do, what does tennis do, what does healthcare do, and seeing like are there cross-pollination threads that we can be like, oh wow, that's interesting how they do that. We should apply it over here. So that's why that's where the source of this question is coming from. How does the FBI enable that level of collaboration and innovation that happens internally? For those of us that are in the outside, it's just a black box. We don't see the inside. So from your perspective, what is that? What does the culture look like? Does the FBI take intentional steps to put people from different domains together? Are people from different divisions free to reach out across the aisle and say, like, hey, we need to work on this? Like, how does that level of collaboration and innovation and openness work in the FBI, to those of us that literally have never seen it?
I think it works in all the ways it can, right? It works in organic ways where folks come together. They see a problem that they need to deal with, and they come together and figure out ways in which to solve it. And as I was talking about, that's the kind of innovation we see sometimes in the field offices. That we're like, wow, why aren't we doing this for everyone? Why isn't this being brought into all field offices? And sometimes it's an organizational challenge that we're all of a sudden dealing with, like AI, where it's not about necessarily field officers just doing something by themselves, but thinking about how do we deal with this organizationally as an issue. And so coming together with, by putting the right people in a room and figuring out what that response is or should be. And so I think, it's all of the above at times, and just finding out the best ways in which to kind of make the solutions work.
Hmm. And an adjacent question to that, and if there's stuff that you can't answer, just let me know. um, Historically, and again, I'm coming from a place of ignorance. Historically, I think that a large part of the technology, the machine learning, all the advanced ways of combating cybercrime came from institutions within the government. So the FBI had divisions to do it. The NSA has been very involved in all that historically, and so I could see how a lot of the core knowledge and know-how was internally. So when the FBI came across a new problem, it's like, okay, let's talk to our friends at the NSA and see how we solve this problem. And again, I'm making stuff up. I don't know if that's the way it works. But now with the latest iteration of AI, and to be clear for listeners, AI has been around for a long time. I mean, people have been talking about AI at the very least since early meetings back at Dartmouth back in the 50s or before that, and Turing tests, and at the very worst, leading back to great thinkers like Socrates who envisioned versions of this. So AI has been around for a while. I was working on machine learning back 20 years ago when it was just known as machine learning, not as the modern state of AI and LLMs. But now with the advent of LLMs and the democratization of AI, a lot of the private sector companies have been taking the lead on things like this, like from OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, all those companies. So now when you see a new threat, does the FBI still have a core nucleus of these world experts internally or in partner organizations like the NSA? Or do you work more with the Googles and the Microsofts and the private organizations to stay ahead and be able to bring in the latest technologies? How does that work? Like organic internal growth versus partnering with other organizations?
I would say that there are a ton of smart people at the Bureau who are constantly working on these issues. But as we've talked about, it's not just about technology, it's about intelligence. It's about understanding what the bad guys are doing and how they're doing it and ways in which they are doing it. That threat intelligence isn't just sitting on FBI systems. It's sitting on systems from private sector partners in a variety of different industries. And so that's where that continuous public-private collaboration is so vital, so that the good guys in the FBI can understand what the private sector folks are seeing on their systems, what they're seeing the bad guys do, how the bad guys are operating. They can learn from that and evolve and think about ways in which that network defenders can get ahead on these problems. The private sector can get ahead on these problems. And the private sector benefits because the FBI and the IC community agencies and the international partners that we have all have unique tools and authorities to get intelligence that the private sector doesn't have. And the FBI can collate and analyze that intelligence and provide threat briefings. It can provide intelligence updates to the private sector in order to keep everyone abreast of what's going on. So I think a lot of that is that continuous collaboration within the public and the private to figure out what's next, to figure out where to go from here. And that's where things like CISA 2015 are so vital, right? That's where FISA 702, which we've talked about, that's one of those tools that we need because that's up for reauthorization next year. And what people need to understand is that a significant portion of the FBI's use of 702 is for cyber. So I shudder to think how we'll blind ourselves if we don't have the right authorities so that we can figure out what the bad guys are doing, how they're targeting us, and what can be done to protect us. And we're seeing some seismic changes in the workforce, the federal workforce right now. And there are talented folks at FBI, CISA, the intelligence community that are both on the front line and the backbone to keeping us safe from these cyber threats. So, for example, at the FBI, there are a cadre of analysts who collate cyber intelligence from investigations, a variety of other sources to generate like a deep understanding of the threat landscape. And then they share that intelligence with state, local, and international partners in the private sector. And when they're disseminating this information, they're doing it to those responsible for keeping our most critical systems secure, whether it's in the public or the private sector. And we almost have to think of our security posture as a collective one and keeping that up to date and constantly moving forward. And so it's going to be crucial for those folks in government to continue to get all the necessary support so they can use their unique tools that only they have and only the partnerships that only they have to support all of us. But I'll say the belt tightening that we're seeing is happening with Congress as well. So we've got this multi-state information sharing and analysis center that is partially funded by Congress, and it's responsible for cyber threat information sharing with state, local, tribal, territorial governments. And they're not going to start charging for access. And if there's one group of folks who have tighter budgets than the feds, that's state and local governments. But these changes are also opportunities for the private sector, right? Because as you talked about, protecting cyber has always been at its heart a public-private partnership. And for companies in the ever-growing cybersecurity space, the disruption of this creates business opportunities. Right? We've talked about how much crucial intelligence is in the private sector. Well, there's an opportunity for companies in that space to find ways to collate and share this intelligence with state and local governments, critical infrastructure sectors, and then using this opportunity to create a pathway for business where organizations with limited personnel and resources can use and benefit from private sector turnkey solutions. So I think all of this, right? It's not it's a balance almost of the public private all working together to save. And so sometimes you have the public taking more on, the public sector taking more on, the private sector taking more on, but it's always that continuous balance to keep us all safe.
One of the things that comes to mind are age-old sayings about the balance between um, safety and liberty. And the more we push towards protection and safety, the more that we're giving up personal liberties. How does the FBI look at that balance? And I know that from the FBI's perspective, the mandate is safety, right? It's like uphold the law. And so what is the balance? What's the countermeasure that's taken to make sure that we do uphold some personal liberties and the freedoms that we all enjoy, while at the same time fighting, like we said before, what feels like an increasing amount of threats that require more and more safety measures?
I mean, the tension you're talking about is an age-old question, and we've talked a little bit about the FBI's mission, but the FBI's mission is not just to protect the American people, but also uphold the Constitution. As a DOJ, as a federal prosecutor in AUSA, that was my job as well, was to uphold the Constitution. Um, and so, whether it's with the DOJ or its law enforcement components, not just FBI, ATF, DEA, HSI, for example, on the DHS side, it's important to remember that they do not act unilaterally in this space, right? DOJ and FBI are bound by the courts, the Constitution, and of course the laws passed by Congress that both limit and allow legal process for surveillance or to counter threats. And I think that's the real rub because when I was a federal prosecutor investigating crimes, I'm using the tools given to me by Congress to further our investigation. So things like grand jury subpoenas or search warrants. Just for example, a law enforcement submits a warrant to a judge who reviews it, determines if the facts presented in that warrant are support a finding of probable cause for the search, and then what's reasonable to search, right? Whether it's a home, an email account, devices, because it's important to remember that there's no absolute right to privacy in the Constitution. It's a reasonable expectation of privacy. And that's balanced against competing social interests of public safety, national security. And because this is a balancing act, at its heart, this tension that you asked about, it's a policy question. And the right folks to answer this question are our elected officials, Congress. So my question for anyone who's thinking through these issues, who's listening to this, if you've got kids or elderly family members, vulnerable folks in your family, who do we want to be making decisions for how they are kept safe online? Because online media platforms, tech companies, and businesses, they naturally worry about the bottom line and what's best for their business. They should. It's 100% their right. It's also why they can't be the ones to unilaterally make decisions in this space, right? And think about it from a business perspective. If you don't have a safe harbor provision to turn over information to law enforcement, do you want to risk that legal jeopardy? Right? Social media companies spend massive, massive amounts of money on trust and safety teams. Of course, they're thinking about reducing that expense by moving to end to end encryption. It's why this problem really is one for Congress to grapple with, right? Because our elected officials, they can hear from families, victims, law enforcement, national security, civil society, and even the private sector, to balance what's necessary with what's required and then pass laws. It's exactly what they've done before, right? And with the Wiretap Act, for example, with the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, ECPA, and it's exactly what they can continue to do now to kind of balance this tension and figure out the right way forward.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes total sense, and clearly, social media is an attack vector and a huge porous safety net that people use and overshare, and it almost and you can see it when it first came out. It was new. People didn't know how to use it. People assumed that the companies had their best interest in mind. Like you said, they didn't. Their best interest was their bottom line and making revenue. But hopefully, society is evolving to the point that we're becoming more savvy about what we put online and what we don't, because anything personal you put out there could be used against you by bad actors that can exploit that information. And but I can definitely see where you would have to have some boundaries as an individual, but then organizations and institutions like the FBI taking steps to protect us even further from things that we just don't anticipate beforehand.
And I'll so the companies could have best intentions of consumers at heart too, right? But
Hmm.
companies cannot prosecute crimes. Companies can't get justice for victims. Companies can't put bad guys in jail. And while they can do some of the proactive things to stop, bad guys from operating on their platforms, when somebody does become a victim, when someone does do something bad on that platform where it's necessary to get justice for society, that's the time in which that's where DOJ, law enforcement at the federal level, the state level, whatever it may be, the local level, they're the ones that need to operate in this space. And I can tell you, right, you need evidence in order to put on a trial, in order to get an indictment from a grand jury, in order to get a search warrant, whatever it may be. And that evidence is on those platforms. And so it's absolutely incumbent to be able to get access to that information, that evidence. But of course, there's, the civil liberties concerns and all of those are theirs. And they're valid concerns too. And balancing all of that, it shouldn't just be done by whether it's the private sector or it should just be done by DOJ and FBI. That really needs to come from Congress that's there to balance all of these competing interests and figure out the best and the right way forward and iterate on that.
With your years in the with the FBI and Department of Justice, obviously we talked about the things that you focus your time on while you were at work. But, I'm sure you saw and heard of things far beyond that. So, what are the kind of threats that kept you up at night? Not just headline grabbing attacks that we all hear about, but the more silent systemic vulnerabilities that felt like could unravel critical systems or infrastructure. And if those threats weren't contained, what did the worst case scenarios actually look like?
I mean, we've talked about how the bad guys go after the services that are essential to our lives. And I'll just give you a quick stat, which is between 2021 and 2024, 15 of our country's 16 critical infrastructure sectors, so sectors like telecom, energy, emergency services, they all fell victim to ransomware. And it's not just cyber criminals, right? We've got rogue nation states, which are also laser focused on critical infrastructure. We've got a variety of the typhoons, that typhoon threats from China. So Volt Typhoon, for example, where a hacking group enabled China to hide and conduct pre-operational reconnaissance and network exploitation against critical infrastructure in this country. In August of this year, the Bureau put out an alert that Russia state-sponsored hackers have targeted thousands of network devices associated with U.S. critical infrastructure. And it's certainly not the first time. So essential services like power, water, transportation, hospitals, schools, there's just not enough money and resources being put into protecting them. And many of those essential services are privately owned. So we've talked about the need for Congress to step up in the emerging technology space, in encryption. This is another area. There was a report from the US Government Accountability Office last year to GAO analyzing four critical sectors: public health, energy, transportation, and manufacturing when it comes to ransomware and other attacks. And what GAO found was that it's largely unknown whether businesses in these sectors are adopting leading cybersecurity practices. They're also going to determine the full impact of ransomware because reporting is generally voluntary and not mandated. In other words, the federal agencies designated to figure out risk for these sectors and then manage that risk, they're largely flying blind. And these sector agencies play a significant role in this space. So Congress needs to give them the tools to mandate reporting from private sector organizations and then require remediation when there's a failure to take affirmative steps to fix security issues. Now, there are some agencies that are requiring cyber breach notification. For example, the SEC requires companies to report material cybersecurity incidents now and disclose on an annual basis information regarding their cybersecurity risk management. States have also gotten into the mix. Water, energy, transportation, hospitals, that's the stuff that keeps me up at night, right? We need all these sector agencies to be given the tools and levers by Congress to ensure that the services we need in our lives will take the steps necessary to protect us all. And I think it could be beneficial for industry as well, right? To operate nationally under the same rules and playbooks, I think can not only just pull up all of our cybersecurity infrastructure, but also help them too to kind of have benchmarks that they can operate with as well in the
Yeah,
space.
that makes total sense. Yeah, I can see losing a lot of sleep over these things. Um, to close out, Rajiv, this has been so fascinating
I
and
apologize. Oh, sorry. I was going to ask, and off the record of what's for including this, one of the things I would like to talk about is kind of one of the questions you had, which I liked, was what if the public better understood about cybercrime?
okay.
I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I saw that question. What do you wish the public understood about cybercrime is actually investigated and where the limits are?
Yeah, I think that's very helpful to help people understand kind of you know, where it is and what they need, because w- as we talk about, one of the things is we don't see a lot of reporting,
Hmm.
and people should report, especially when and companies should report, and so I think that's something that I think will be helpful,
Okay.
if that's
So,
okay.
yeah, it's totally. I just wanted to make sure that you can go past 11.
Oh yeah, yeah, I'm fine. Don't worry about it.
Okay, cool.
I
Um,
gave another half hour on this just in case.
just in case, perfect. All right. So Rajiv, the world that you've lived in feels so overwhelming for someone like me who's hearing it from the first time, and it feels so encompassing, all encompassing, and so diverse in the fields and the threats that you encounter and how you try to stay ahead of things. Um, so it almost feels, for me personally, it feels overwhelming to ask you very specific questions because I don't even know where to start. But um, I guess more broadly, what do you wish the public better understood about how cybercrime is actually investigated and where the limits are?
I'd say the importance of prevention in cyber, right? And how crucial it is for companies and individuals to reach out to law enforcement if they are the victims of cyber attacks. With my experience in government, I see how critical it is for the private sector to work with law enforcement in the moments after an attack happens or is detected. And the companies who are most on top of this are the ones that are working with experienced counsel, right? Counsel who can help you manage a crisis after an attack, have the technical savvy to work with the forensic recovery team, know how to bring in law enforcement effectively. And importantly, if necessary, preserve attorney-client privilege, right? So often what I've seen is companies or the council evaluating bringing in law enforcement as a binary decision when it's in reality far more nuanced, right? And experienced counsel can really help companies navigate that. And it's also just as important, we talked about prevention, to work with the right counsel before the attack, whether it's evaluating your company's cyber posture, determining insider risk, putting in place policies and playbooks, figuring out your cyber breach reporting requirements, working with counsel to establish a relationship with law enforcement, and not trying to figure out the roles that everyone has in the chaos of an attack, right? But doing that work beforehand to figure out who will be on point, where your risk lies, what your legal obligations might be, especially in regulated industries like defense, for example, before the attack. And just as an example, take the Hive takedown, which we talked about. The FBI over there was able to get access to the bad guys' servers They were able to identify victims and then use that to offer decryption keys for the victims of the ransomware attacks to get their system back online and prevented something like $130 million in ransomware payments. Do you know what the FBI also found? That only about 20% of the Hive victims that they identified, which are largely private sector organizations, only 20% had reported those attacks to law enforcement. It's just through sheer ingenuity and effort that the FBI was able to identify victims. But just imagine how much easier it would have been and more quickly the FBI personnel could have gotten decryption keys out if victims had come forward. And I'll say this doesn't just apply to businesses, right? Because individuals can also benefit if they reach out to law enforcement when they're the victim of a cybercrime. So the FBI has a recovery asset team whose entire goal is to function as a liaison between law enforcement and financial institutions. And one of those functions is to help freeze and recover fraudulently stolen assets. And this team has a success rate of somewhere in the mid 70% when they get involved. I mean, that's pretty high. And but all of that success it really hinges on timing. Individuals immediately reporting to the FBI in their financial institution when they've been defrauded because right time is of the essence. The bad guys, as soon as they can, are going to move those funds offshore. They're going to move those funds to their home countries where those funds cannot be recovered. So making sure that the FBI and the financial institution have a chance to take action before that happens is absolutely crucial, and it's why it's important to for victims both on the corporate side as well as for individuals to report when they are been the victims of cybercrime.
That's really interesting. Yeah, no, the analogy doesn't quite hold because it's all defense, but it feels like you need to have a defense strategy and an offense strategy. It's like put up the barriers, put up the blockades, put up the virus protection, and everything you need to do to prevent people from getting in. But you have to take that additional step to say, okay, but if and when they do get in, then what is our protocol? What is our workflow? What do we do immediately and who plays what role so there's no confusion internally and be prepared for the worst case scenario? Hopefully it never happens. Hopefully your defenses are strong enough. But if they do get through your defenses, you've got to be ready and know exactly how to act in order to protect yourself.
I'll say after a significant amount of time doing this, it's not if you get attacked, it's when you get attacked, right? And sometimes you get attacked and your defenses are great and they keep the bad guys out. And sometimes they don't. But being ready for all those eventualities, I think, is exactly what cybersecurity professionals live for. It's those of us who operate in this space, that's what we live for, to kind of make sure that you're ready for all those eventualities. And so it's important for companies and private sector organizations to start thinking about that as soon as possible to get ready for it.
No, that's incredible. Amazing advice. So, Rajiv, this has been an incredible conversation, and I could stay here talking to you for hours because, and I don't think we'd scratch the surface, honestly. But just to to finish off from your vantage point, if you've experienced so much of this for so many years and seen so much, and I'm sure there's an enormous amount that you can't share. That's the stuff I really want to get to, but obviously, that's not the kind of stuff you can talk about. But from your vantage point, where do you think the future of cyber threats is really headed? And and what does a secure, resilient digital society look like in 10 years from now if we get it right? Or what does it look like if we get it wrong?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's a lot of AI hype, and I'll be honest with you, on the cyber side, it's not necessarily hype. There's a lot of reality there, right? We're seeing bad guys, cyber criminals, nation state hackers, you name it, using AI to up their game and force multiply, right? We've all been inured to phishing emails and detecting bad grammar and spelling mistakes and weird company logos so we can spot a phishing email when we get it. Well, the bad guys are using AI and Gen AI and LLMs to kind of up their game, right? If you're not a native English speaker, you're using Gen AI and LLMs to perfect your English and make it write a letter for you. You're using it to make it do 100,000 variations on that letter so it can get through spam filters, right? And all you need is to deceive one human because at the end of the day, our weakest point continues to be humans in all of this. Um, and we haven't even gotten to, using, for example, deep fakes, right? And being able to use deep fakes to get on a video call where you think you're talking to your boss and they're sitting in a vacation home and they're asking you to, reach out and speak to a client and they send you a link. except it's not your boss. It's somebody impersonating it using voice cloning and deepfakes. And so, there's a lot of this out there and it's going to continue to be out there. The good thing is it's not all doom and gloom, right? We've talked about how AI is great at protecting systems. AI is also great at detecting AI, right? And so the hope is to kind of get at those phishing emails, what have you, before they ever get past filters and before they ever get to the humans and all of this. Um, you know, I'll be honest, and slight diversion over here, but thinking about this from a trial prosecutor perspective, one of the things, right, is when shows like CSI came out, and you kind of started to have these fantastical displays of technology and how they influence juries to come to expect that when the government presents its case, it'll have videos, photos, analysis that literally show the defendant committing the crime in like 360-degree views, right? And I start thinking about what's going to happen when AI generated images and videos are commonplace. And juries are increasingly trained not to trust the video or the audio or the image that's put in front of them. One of the most basic tools that you learn in trial practice is to authenticate a piece of evidence, right? A photograph or a video, whatever it may be. But what's going to happen when we've flooded with convincing AI generated images and we're going to have this seismic effect in court about how do we prove what's real and what's not, right? And how do we demonstrate to a jury that what they're seeing in court with their own two eyes is in fact real? And so good news is that, private sector is already thinking through this, not necessarily on the trial side, but generally about tagging and the importance of all of that. But I think that's something that's going to need to happen, and it's going to be a bumpy transition, And we've talked about bad guys using AI, right? Think about it, we've talked about cyber criminals, but you've also got China and Russia using AI to up their, disinformation campaigns. And China's been hacking, for years, stealing information. Think about how they can use information on the open web and hacked information that they've stolen in LLMs to be able to do better impersonations, to be able to do better social engineering when it comes to phishing campaigns. And so I think we've talked about this a lot, but I think the answer is always working together, right? It's not one group of folks who are going to somehow get this ball across the finish line. It's really everyone working together as a team on this because it's a public-private partnership across sectors, agencies, geographic boundaries. And there's a meaningful investment that needs to happen in cybersecurity and digital resiliency, but it needs to happen by everyone. And that information sharing has to happen by everyone. So really everyone brings their tools and their authorities and the information that they have to bear to, get consequences for the bad guys who are operating in this space.
Yeah, I think those are words that obviously describe what you did and what the FBI does so well. But as I reflect on broader society, it's a battle that's not just cybercrime, and it's not just a battle that's the FBI. To your point, the collaboration is critical because so much of society is based on trust, right? It's, there are abstract figments of agreement between people that say, this is the end of my property, this is the beginning of yours, all the way to this dollar bill has value, very abstract value, because in and of itself, this piece of paper means nothing, but you have to trust that it has some value. So when I pass it to you, you can use it for something else. And trust really is what allows societies to function. You mentioned patents before. It's a trust that that's going to hold some currency and some value and be protected in some ways. And a lot of what we're seeing here and a lot of what we talked about today is really a deterioration of that trust. It's a deterioration of the trust that I can trust the money that I put into a bank is going to be there, or that a video that I'm looking at is real, or a photograph, or a conversation, and so on. And so it's fascinating to hear the work that you did and the FBI is doing. It's also terrifying to think about how all this is evolving and how we're not just protecting bank accounts, but really the fabric of what society is made of and our ability to trust each other and to live in a coherent way with each other. And so anyways, we can become very philosophical about this, but I think this has been truly such an insightful conversation. I learned so much, and I'm so grateful for your time and for sharing all of your experience with us, Rajeev. Thank you again. Thank you for being on the show, and I really look forward to having a conversation like this with you again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. I very much appreciate it. This has been fun.
That was Rajeev Raghavan. Now, Unnatural Signals.
What emerged here was a very different picture of innovation. Not flashy, not centralized, and not purely technological. The signals that we're archiving are the shift from catching bad actors to disrupting the infrastructure that makes harm possible. Innovation often starts at the edges, small teams, field offices, localized experiments before it scales. Public-private trust isn't a nice-to-have, it's the core defense mechanism of the digital world. And in a borderless threat landscape, rigidity is a liability, even for institutions built on rules. This conversation made something clear. The organizations that survive aren't the most powerful. They're the ones that can coordinate, adapt, and share intelligence without losing their integrity.
Thanks for listening to Unnatural Selection. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone shaping the future. Explore more at unnaturalselection.net and connect with us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Until next time, keep evolving.